do that.
Yeah, let's do that.
Lunch or dinner.
Yeah, yeah, we get time. And that is whether we sit outside somewhere nice.
Yeah, that would be perfect. I love that.
Everyone can see me and hear me when I'm loud. If you have any issues hearing the speakers tonight, let me know, because we do have a microphone setup that we can do. We're going to try and avoid it for right now, because you guys can project very well.
We will.
Okay. So good evening and welcome to Roundabout Books Thursday Author Night. I'm Julie, the events manager. We want to take this opportunity to acknowledge that our bookstore resides on the ancestral unceded lands of the Confederate tribes of Warm Springs. And in our immediate area are also the unceded lands of the Confederate tribes of Siletz Indians and the tribes of Grand Ronde. We encourage everyone to learn more about the land you occupy and the story of its peoples. And then a quick reminder of some upcoming events. So on June 2nd, we have a really fun launch party for the Central Oregon Book Project, which features local authors writing about the special place we call home. And then on June 7th, Bend resident Jess Boscheman will be here to talk about Hike 366, Tales of Year-Round Hiking. And on June 9th, we'll chat with Kim Cooper Findling about the second edition of Bend Oregon Daycations, a travel guide of 23 Oregon day trips within 2 hours of Bend. So lots of outdoorsy stuff coming. So be sure to visit our website, which is roundaboutbookshop.com, for our event and book club calendar. Order books for pickup or shipping, and then get all the news about the books you should be reading. So this event is being recorded for our YouTube channel, where you can find recordings of events back to May of 2020. Tonight we are joined by two Bend authors, Glenn Voelz and Dave Edlund, who between them have published more than 24 books. Glenn Voelz is a retired Army intelligence officer, worked in leadership positions at the Pentagon and White House Situation Room and at NATO headquarters. He is the author of War Under the Mango Tree, Operation Hermes, and the Third Force, among others. And Dave Edlund is the award-winning author of the Peter Savage series. When he's not cooking up the latest adventures for his characters, he can be found working as a leading expert in hydrogen energy. So I'm going to turn it over to both of you right now, because I'm very excited to hear this conversation about books, publishing, and everything that goes along with it. So please, everyone.
So I'll start just by explaining why we're here together, and also I want to preface this by saying this is completely informal. This is really just a continuation of a conversation we had over coffee a month ago. So please interrupt and jump in if anyone has questions or comments. Interrupt, because it's really just a discussion. So why we're here together, I think it was 2017 when we first met, and at that time I had a unpublished manuscript. That War Under the Mango Tree, and didn't know what to do with it. I had published some nonfiction previously and some professional journal articles, so I had publications, but nothing, all nonfiction. And I know that Dave had been a mentor to local writers, and I think you had taught some classes at COCC on getting published, and so your name was out there, and I cold called you, sent you an email saying, can we get together for coffee, can you help me figure out what to do with this? And I don't know how much you remember that conversation, but it was extremely helpful for me in terms of how to strategize, finding a publisher, writing a query letter, all the things that you need to do with that first manuscript to get it out there and get it published. And it was incredibly helpful, because I was just sort of lost, not knowing what to do, because publishing fiction is so a completely different animal than publishing nonfiction. If you're publishing in a journal, there's a very understood kind of standard process for how you approach journals and pitch those, and the same for nonfiction too. You have a proposal, a very structured proposal, and you can sell nonfiction before you have the first word written if you have a very structured proposal. As opposed to fiction, unless you're really famous, you pretty much have to have a finished, pretty polished manuscript that you pitch to the publishers. And you kind of walked me through that process and really helped me with a strategy for identifying publishers too that were kind of in the realm of possibility for what I was trying to do. And that was very helpful too, because I think part of the reason I was able to get a publisher is because you helped me devise that strategy and look for a group of publishers that was appropriate for my goals were, what I was trying to do. And also in helping to write that query letter too, because that's a huge challenge for writers trying to break in, is having a good query letter where you pitch your idea to publishers. So that's how Dave and I first met, and you set me up and helped me with that strategy, and took a while, but a year later, after that conversation, I finally got a publisher that was interested in seeing chapters, and probably 15 months after that conversation, they offered me a contract for that first book. So thank you for that help. That's why we're here together, is because of that first meeting in 2017, which was enormously helpful for me.
Yeah, and then we continue to stay in touch and compare notes. Both Glenn and I have published fiction and nonfiction, and I think, like Glenn, I started with nonfiction, which is an entirely different game than fiction. In fact, I found it exceedingly challenging to shift from nonfiction to fiction. I don't know what your experience was with that.
Absolutely, because my career previously as an intelligence officer, my job was writing, but it was writing highly, and we have another intelligence officer here backing up on this, Les, had a career going from intelligence into writing nonfiction and history, local history. But in the intelligence community, you have a highly formatted, very structured type of writing, and you know your customer, you're writing specifically to answer questions to satisfy that customer's information needs for decision making. And there isn't any room for creativity. And in fiction, they always say you need to show, not tell. When you're writing in the intelligence community, you're telling, not showing. So it's completely different in terms of your approach and your structure. So yeah, it's very, very difficult to go from that into fiction. Although a lot of my experiences professionally did inform my fiction, it still was not easy taking those experiences and turning them into narrative and developing characters and doing plot development. All of those things were completely different and enormous challenge. So I think we had that same experience in transitioning to a different genre.
Yeah, very much. I found the idea of being intentionally vague, right? Trying to write about emotions and implied thoughts or actions completely counter to anything that you would do in nonfiction. And entertainment, right? Fiction is for entertainment. Nonfiction, entertainment really doesn't overlap with that particular category. So that really was tough to work through. But once I came to grips with it, there was this whole new world of possibilities. Right? So my degree is in science, and I work in science and engineering. And obviously that's bounded by natural laws. That's not true in fiction, right? I mean, you can do pretty much whatever you want as long as you bring the reader along with you. And so that freedom in writing was very refreshing.
Well, your books are pretty grounded, though, in your scientific work as well, very informed by your scientific work. And and also your business travels related to that scientific work. So a lot of your professional life comes through in your fiction.
And that was a choice. I write thrillers. More correctly, they might be called techno-thrillers or maybe geopolitical thrillers. But it's a genre that I've enjoyed reading for a long, long time, decades. But it annoys me when authors put in gobbledygook. And it's probably because of my background. So it was an intentional decision when I started writing this to use fiction as a tool to introduce real-world concepts, whether it be engineering, whether it be medicine, whether it be geopolitics, into the story. So that part, there's a very solid grounding of that, but at the end of the day, it's still fiction. So.
Now, one difference between our writing is my books take place in fictional country, and yours are set in actual country, where I think probably you've traveled for business, for work travel, and most of them. Do you feel, is it a lot of pressure to have to set your books in actual places? I can kind of play with mine a little bit because it's a made-up country, and it gives me some latitude and slack in terms of how I describe the setting, the scenes, the geopolitical situation.
See, I would think that what you did is harder, actually, because I can fall back on my memory of places I've been. I can go to Google. I've got maps, right? So I mean, all of these resources available to me. So that part of it really is quite easy. I think what you're doing is a fictional country, a fictional locale. I think that's a little more challenging.
When you were traveling professionally, were you always taking notes and thinking thinking about putting these locales into your novels? 'Cause
No.
you have what, Libya, Sudan, China, what,
Yeah,
trying to think of all the places
A
where
lot in
books have been
China,
set.
Venezuela, Russia. No, only recently, only in the last few years, I started thinking about that. In fact, I've traveled a lot to Asia in the last several years, and in China and Taiwan, when you're in large cities, which it's somewhat hard to fathom, but in China, a large city is like 10 million and up. If you're in a city with 2 or 3 million people, that's really not a big city. It's hard to come to grips with that. But when you go through these very densely populated areas, number one, universally they're dual use. So they're businesses and residences. The businesses on the ground floor, residences above. It's just a solid block of buildings where each building might be, or each business might be the width between these bookcases. And then they just open up onto the sidewalk in the street. And you can buy bulk steel tubing, you can buy tires, they'll do automobile repairs, anything you can think of for a business they do in these small shops. Now they're deep, they might be 40, 50 feet deep, but they're not more than 20 feet wide. And above them are the residences. And people sit out on buckets or maybe a chair, and it's a slower pace, very connected with the traffic. And it's just so much different than what I'm used to seeing in the West that I decided I had to put that into one of my novels, but I wanted to tie it back to the mid-20th century, particularly the beginning of World War II, and the Japanese occupation in China and Taiwan. So I was consciously thinking about that while I was in, I don't remember if it was in China or Taiwan. And another thing that probably most Americans don't realize is that in Japan, Taiwan, China, these are very, very monopolar when it comes to ethnicity. Right? It's not a melting pot, not at all. And very, very strong national ideals, very strong connection to their history, but not always welcoming of outsiders. And that, of course, was represented by a lot of the conflict and atrocities in the mid-20th century. So it was all of those thoughts coming together that I decided I got to put that into one of my novels. But that's really the only time that that's happened. Otherwise, my travels have mostly been prior to my writing. And just dug them up and decided to do some locales.
Yeah. And when did the first Peter Savage novel come out? I'm trying to remember.
I think it was around 2012.
And when we were having coffee last month, correct me if I'm wrong, you were telling me a story about how that first one got published, and I didn't realize until you told me that it originally started as a self-published novel and then got picked up, which I thought was fascinating because it's. I know a lot of new authors are trying to decide, okay, do I self-publish or do I find a traditional publisher? You kind of ended up doing both, which I thought was a great story.
Yeah, I did. So long story short, in 2009, I was living in Massachusetts, and my son, I'm sorry, in 2008, and my son was turning 9 years old. I was a little bit homesick from the West Coast, and so I decided to write a story for my son, a fictional story. Despite his age, being 9 years old, he was a real big fan of Clive Cussler. I don't know if any of you read Clive Cussler novels, but they're very clean, action-oriented thrillers. And so my son was just eating them up. So I thought, what the heck, I'll write a novel and I'll base the hero in Bend, Oregon. And so that is where my protagonist lives. It's over in the old mill district in what you would know as the REI building. That's actually where Peter Savage lives. And so I wrote the story just intending to give it to my son as a birthday gift. And I shared it with a friend of mine who I've known since high school, English major, and he said, you know what, you really ought to get this published. So I went down the rabbit hole, deep, and spent a long time trying to find a publisher, and I failed. I just couldn't do it. So my friend Gary not being willing to give up, he says, well, just go self-publish it. Like, just take a walk around the block. So that was a whole learning process in and of itself. But I did that, and the book went out. That book, by the way, is Crossing Savage, but it came out under a different title. It was called Unintended Consequences. And so I self-published that. I think it was in 2010. And at the time, I had the opportunity to list the book with a company named Bowker that sells the ISBN. The ISBN is the unique 13-digit code that identifies every book. You have to buy those, by the way. They don't just give them to you. So I bought my ISBN, and then Bowker said, well, for another $100, we'll list your book in this catalog, and occasionally agents or publishers will scroll through the catalog. I thought, yeah, sure. But in for a penny, in for a pound, I gave him another $100 and got my book listed. And sure enough, 9-10 months later, my publisher contacted me. The company that became my publisher contacted me, and that's where they found it. So I just looked into that. For any of you who are writing, I know Les here is an author. Tell me if you disagree with me, Les, but I would argue that luck is far more important than skill in publishing. You need to be in the right place at the right time, talking to the right people. There are a lot of very good writers out there, and many that just never get the recognition they deserve because they don't have the luck to be with the right people at the right time. But in my case, luck worked out, so I got connected with the publisher. But that got me into both the whole traditional process of trying to find a publisher, as well as self-publishing. And then I've since published a short story in ebook format only, so I didn't bother taking that to my publisher. I just self-published that through Amazon. But it was based on those experiences that I shared with Glenn. And I used to offer that through a continuing education course here at COCC. There are a lot of people here that are interested in being authors.
And so when did the discussion, when you got picked up by the publisher, when did the discussion about the series begin?
Oh, right away. Right away.
So you hadn't envisioned a series necessarily?
Honestly, no. Honestly, I didn't even envision publishing the story. Right? I mean, honest to God, I really thought it was going to be a one-off gift for my son, and only he and I would ever read it. But once I started talking to my publisher, the publisher was keenly interested in the series. And the idea from the publisher's perspective, of course it's a business. The publisher is not in it because they're into the prose or the art or the entertainment factor. They want to make money. Now, for a new author, it's very hard to get recognition. Very hard. So there's a lot of investment that has to go into getting a new author out there. There are hundreds of thousands of new titles that come on the market in the United States every year. And the average reader is going to see maybe 100 or a few hundred. So how do you get a new title out there? And it takes a lot of investment. So from the publisher's perspective, once they get that new author and that new title out there, if it's a series, they can build on that, right? Because if you get people interested in the first book, it's easier to get them to come back and say, oh, I like that first book. Let me get the second one too. And then the third one, and then the fourth one. And then you have the decision as an author, are the stories going to be standalone? Or do they have to be read in order? And if they're going to be read in order, the most common way to do it is a trilogy. But I decided from the very beginning I did not want to write stories that had to be read in sequence. I wanted anyone to be able to pick it up at any point in time and be able to get what's going on, and then they could decide if they want to go forward, backwards, or not. So that was my choice, but the publisher was very keen on supporting the series.
And how many books are there in this particular series?
So in the Peter Savage series, I think there are now 8. Okay. I've also written with a different character, a female character, who's introduced in the Peter Savage novels. But I took her out into her own own world, our own adventures, simply because, and I never thought I would feel this way as a reader. You know, I don't know how many Dirk Pitt novels there are by Clive Cussler, or how many Sigma novels there are by James Rawlins, but there's a lot, right? You know, I can read those over and over and over in any order, and I never get tired of them. It never feels contrived. But when you're writing them, it's like, oh geez, you know, 9 months ago, Peter was in this tight spot, and now he's in a tight spot again. Who's going to believe that, right? So,
But
I don't-
I wanted to ask, did it become easier or harder to write them as you went along?
it got harder actually.
Yeah.
It got harder because I was finding myself in that blog like, no one's going to believe this could possibly happen to this guy again, right?
Yeah.
So, but you know, as a reader, I don't feel that way at all about the characters. But as a writer, it really began to affect my ability to think up a creative way to get Peter into trouble.
Yeah. So I think my series is a little more interconnected than yours, because yours,
Mhm.
you mentioned that yours, you could jump into the middle of your series.
Right.
I tried to design mine to do that, but I don't think it's necessarily possible. But I found mine are a little more sequential, and the plot's a little more connected throughout the 3 books. But that's a different kind of challenge in that you have to kind of
It is.
you're
It is.
wedded to what you did before.
Right.
Whereas your books, I picked up your book. I think I started your series in the middle, and then actually went back,
Right.
and didn't have a problem with that at all.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
worked fine for me as a reader.
Right. So I would imagine that you had to think out, you kind of had to have in your head this whole, at least the hierarchy of the plot for all 3 novels.
I
before
did.
you jumped in. I did.
No, because I didn't start at all on the second book until I got a publisher for the first one.
Okay, but you intended to write a trilogy, right?
I didn't pitch it that way, and I
Okay.
didn't really necessarily intend it that way, and kind of conceived of it after, once I got a contract with the publisher, then I thought, okay, I left the door open. I thought maybe there's a chance at some point if I get a publisher I can continue on. So I didn't close out that door and left some unanswered questions at the beginning of the first one, but really didn't start doing a plot outline on the second or third at all until I got the contract. And then I said, okay, well,
Yeah.
we'll give this a chance.
Yeah.
But I was pretty meticulous about the way I did format those. All my books, I think we discussed kind of process. I use a spreadsheet and actually
Right.
lay out the plot.
Right.
And all 3 of my books have exactly, all have 12 chapters, and each of those 12 chapters has 3 to 4 scene settings, and each of those are plotted out on a spreadsheet. So I was pretty meticulous in terms of the way I organized the plot, character development, and the narrative. And the books are all roughly the same length as
Right.
well. So I think in terms of the design and the layout and the structure, they're pretty similar. But it was more difficult as I went along because the plot is dependent on the previous
Mhm.
books, and so it's kind of the narrowing of the funnel as you go down, and the elimination of possibility as you move forward in the plot, which makes it, I think, a little more difficult than writing the standalone books. But by the same token, it is easier because you do know the characters, you know the fictional setting, and you come to the plot line, the back histories of those characters. So that enables you to kind of move forward and dispense with some of the creativity as you move along, because some of those questions have been answered and resolved in previous segments of the book.
Now, you said something about your process that caused me to ask this question. So I'm guessing that you outlined in some detail, maybe a fair bit of detail.
Yeah, a lot of detail.
Yeah, yeah.
And I find that 70% of the work.
It is.
Truthfully,
That's
because
right. That's
once
right.
that spreadsheet was done,
Yeah.
I felt, maybe not 70%, but I felt like half the book was done,
Right.
and by the time the spreadsheet was done, and probably for the second, third book, the spreadsheet took me 6 months
Yeah.
to do,
Yeah.
and the writing took 6 months,
Right.
because just the interactions between the characters and just the revealing of the end building towards the climax of books too. Of course, you don't
Yeah.
want to really reveal too much, but you have to keep the narrative moving along, so you have to give just little details of the plot as you move. And for me, that was the hardest part of the process, and I was revising that spreadsheet over and over again. But once that was done, I was ready to write. It was
Yeah.
really a pretty smooth process from that point. Obviously, coming up with dialogue and some of the detail, but the hardest part was just building that structure in the spreadsheet for me.
So the reason I asked that question is that there's always this, it's not really a debate, it's a discussion in the fiction world. Are you an outliner, plotter, or are you a pantser, right? You go by the seat of your pants. And like Glenn, my very first novel, because I really didn't know what I was going to do with it, I'd never written fiction before, I outlined in meticulous detail. And then I had to write the book. And the second one, I thought, I wrote that first book twice. The first time was when I outlined it, and then was when I took the outline and converted it into a novel. I'm not going to do that anymore. So I was encouraged by, I think it was Matthew Riley, who's written some phenomenal fiction, but he does what I don't like, which he just throws in these wacko things now and then that have no basis in reality. But he's got this incredible ability to write high octane, very, very fast-paced fiction, thrillers. But he said, when asked, he goes, I know where I'm going to begin and I know where I'm going to end before I start writing. Everything else just gets figured out along the way. And early on, I thought, how do you do that? And as I got later and later into it, yeah, I can see that. Yeah, Julie.
Well, so two things. One, you had a question. I don't want to see this.
Oh, no, they directly went into
Okay.
the trilogy.
So I kind of wanted to ask both of you about self-editing. So if you're not going to do that spreadsheet, what's helping you as you maybe do your self-edits, making sure that your continuity is there, your characters are doing things that they would normally do? And I ask this because I'm an editor, and so then I'm doing it, but I'm also sometimes telling people. And one of the things we learned was to almost do like post-it notes of the scenes, like
Yeah.
once it's written, and then see if you need to move them around at all. So do you do anything like that?
I have, actually, yeah. And my editor wanted me to take a photo of my cork board, okay, and send it to her, which I did. And I found that very useful, right? So if you think about any novel, any genre, you know, you've got a beginning, you've got an end, and then you have filler that needs to be entertaining. And that usually involves some level of uncertainty or mystery, right? There may be some suspense, and then a little bit of release of that suspense building up to something even bigger. And so later, I was really just working off of that, right? I mean, I have this general idea of what I need to have between the front and the end, and I know by word count or page count, you know, I work off of word count about where that needs to happen. And then I may or may not know what those suspense elements are going to be. More than once I found myself getting into, you know, halfway through the book and think, you know, I got to start building up a climax here. What is it going to be? But, you know, you take a break from it, you know, maybe for a few days, a week, or something happens that inspires you. But inevitably it comes to you, and then you go from there. Yeah.
Glenn, kind of on the flip side of that, sorry, jump in. When you're making that spreadsheet though, have you found that once you get to that part, a certain part in writing the story, does it change? Does the thing that you thought was going to happen first now not make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So it's not a final product.
Right.
In terms of editing, well, I've the fortune of having an editor here, so Lord definitely helps me as well in keeping me on track and pointing out. I mean, there's several times in the last two books where you pointed out that something just this doesn't work, this doesn't make sense, and having to go back and, you know, usually there aren't major changes, but you've caught me on a few that, you know, clearly just I go back and look at it like, oh, she's right, that doesn't make any sense. So you know, you got to have other readers for sure. I do have, I guess I had the good fortune to have a model for some of the plot. My books are set in a fictional country, but for people who have traveled in Africa that know Africa can probably pick out a few countries that the book is highly based on, and that helps too. Having a history, even though it's not specifically based on one, you know, knowing you can fall back on actual events, things that I saw or experienced, or things that have occurred in the last 10 or 15 years in some countries that the stories are based on, also helps too in terms of structuring that plot. my books are satire. They're fiction and they're satire, but they are based on things that have happened, closely based. So that helps provide structure too, when you have something to fall back on. And I think in that sense, some of your books are, you kind of have a foot in both reality and fiction, in that you have some structures, particularly the geopolitics are I think well grounded, and science is well grounded, but then you kind of are pretty free with some of the adventure aspects of it, and some of the taking those actual facts and locations, geopolitics and science, and transforming that into a fictional narrative.
That's a lot of fun, and as a writer, I find that part very rewarding. So it's the what if, right? What if this happened? It's a lot of fun.
And I'm so curious what your son thought of the book that you read, and if he contributed to the subsequent ones, and then for both of you, if you have a particular reader in mind or sense of the reader, or if you're just ever.
Well, I'm proud to say my son loved it, but he's probably not an unbiased reader either, right? But I got a good thumbs up from him. So the type of reader that I'm writing to, I hope anyway, is I'm looking for several things. Again, I'm writing techno thrillers, so there's weaponry in there, there's science, there's engineering, there's military in there, there's conflict, people get shot, people die. So readers who are fans of Matthew Riley, James Rollins, that genre. But I want them to be inquisitive, right? I'm hoping they'll appreciate the reality that's brought into these. I mean, there's a lot of scary stuff out there. There really is. And intentionally, I want to bring that to the reader, right? I want people. We just went through 2 years of COVID. A couple of years prior to that, I wrote about smallpox and the weaponization of that, and the incredible threat, in my opinion, that represents. And so, through fiction, I'm hoping to get people to think about these things and be aware of it, but do it in an entertaining, non-threatening, not standing on anyone's soapbox and beating the drum, and just trying to get it out there so that people are aware of it. There's a lot of scary stuff in this world.
If I could ask you a question, you were talking about your audience and how you've modeled it after these other writers. And then you mentioned that you had a female character that you took out of one book. Did you start a series with a female character? And what did that take? Because as a male, right, you pretty much represent the reader. Right.
Right.
What are you going to do with this woman? Because you don't represent that.
I know. And I want to answer that question. I want to give Glenn an opportunity to answer from your perspective. What kind of audience are you writing to?
Too narrow an audience, I think. I think there's a large audience for thrillers. Certainly what you do, I think. But mine are thrillers or satire in the guise of a thriller, and so there's no more limited audience for that. And I think probably people who are interested in national security issues, probably people who have spent time or at least familiar with Africa and geopolitics. So it's probably not done as good a job as I should have in terms of reaching a wider audience, or at least certainly my publisher would want me to advertise to a wider audience in terms of the way I advertise the book or speak about the book. But it's kind of challenging. You write what you know, and my most positive feedback have come from people who have some similar experiences that overlap in their careers. Wes, you and I, when we met, we had very similar careers, and in a lot of ways had a lot of overlaps, different time period, but we were in a lot of the same places doing a lot of the similar things. And I think I was kind of writing for an audience like you, who probably had similar experiences and knew some of the things.
You picked the right guy.
Yeah, exactly. My audience of one. I appreciate it. You're who I was writing for. And I'm a huge fan of your books as well, so you were writing for me. So we just write each other all the time.
Just send it to the director.
Yeah, but that it's a great question, because if you do want to publish, that's the first question that a publisher is going to ask you. Who is your audience? Who are you trying to write to? How big is this audience? How are you going to reach them? If you can't answer those questions, you're not going to get published for fiction or nonfiction. That's the first thing that has to be in your query letter. This is who I'm writing for. This is how big this population is, and this is why it's going to appeal to them. If you can't make that case, no one's going to publish your book.
But what I've really appreciated in your books is the witty dialogue, and I love that. Lee Child does that in spades with Jack Reacher, and you captured it really well too. So I don't fit the audience that you're writing to, because I've got no military background, no intelligence background, but I love the witty dialogue, so it worked with me. I think your audience might be larger than you're giving yourself credit for.
Well, a lot of the dialogue was pulled from experience, from characters I've met, and there's a phrase or I've said in the past. A lot of people I met during my military career in the national security and intelligence community were great characters to be developed. I mean, they were people of great character, but also many of them were just great characters because they lacked character. Because there's definitely some rogues that I write about in the books, and these are all based on actual people that I've met over the years, and obviously embellished a little bit, but that helps in creating the dialogue and the plot. In that I've known some of these people, unfortunately, during my career. It makes it a little bit easier to develop these characters and turn them into fiction.
So to answer your question, coming back to that now, female protagonist. So if anyone here is a fan of thrillers like I am, you got Brad Thor, Brad Taylor, Lee Child, Matthew Riley, James Rollins, Clive Cussler, when he was writing. These are all male protagonists, right? The genre is full of male protagonists. And my editor is a woman, and she used to give me no end of crap about that, right? She said, you gotta get women into your story. And I write clean fiction, so the only way it was going to happen was either through being a main character, either supporting the protagonist or antagonist, one way or the other. And so I accepted the challenge, and I thought, yeah, I'm a man, obviously, but I think I can imagine how a badass woman would work as a protagonist. And so I took it on as a challenge, and I started writing the character in a minor role in my Peter Savage novels. And giving me a little bit of background, the character is Danya Baton. That's an Israeli name, Jewish name, and she's a former Mossad agent who decided that what she was doing really wasn't that ethical. She wasn't going to do it anymore. So she quits, but as I like to say in my teasers, no one quits Mossad. So she's on the run, and she ends up here in Central Oregon, and ends up in some adventures with Peter Savage. And so based on that, I took her out into her own stories. It began with a short story, which is available as an ebook only, and then I took her into her own full-length novel that was released last spring, Judgment in Alcatraz. And yeah, I think it is challenging for me anyway. I won't say that my experience represent all male authors, but I found it challenging to try to think the way a woman would. But at the end of the day, survival is survival. Conflict is conflict. And how you feel about morality and how you feel about your country and things like that. I don't think that changes too much with whether you're male or female. So anyway, that's how I dealt with it. It wasn't easy, but I thought it was important to do, and I had a lot of fun doing it.
And how are they doing?
It's hard to tell, and the reason it's hard to tell is that I have two measures. One is feedback based on reviews, and reviews lag the launch date of a book by 1 to 2 years. chapters, quite honestly. It takes a long time for reviews to tally up. And then the other is my sales numbers. But my publisher gives me a royalty check quarterly, but that royalty check represents sales from 6 months prior. So it's hard to measure until you get much further out. The feedback that I've had though has been that it's good. Yeah.
And you're done with Peter Savage, right?
Never say never.
Never.
Never say never.
We have another question.
So, Glenn, you mentioned that like a lot of your characters are coming from people you may or may not have worked with in the past. Have you had anyone reach out and say, "Hey"?
Fortunately, no. I would say loosely based.
Okay.
Very, very loosely based. And most of them are composites. You're drawn from several people that I've worked with or knew. And you know, there's no. I don't think there's anyone in any of the books that would identify themselves as that was me as a character. But you know, my books are set in this fictional African country, and the main character, the protagonist, is an African military officer. And I spent 3 years working on security assistance programs in Africa, going around to various countries, working with our partner militaries there. So I had a lot of interactions with African officers, and you know, and so I'm writing based on some of the people that I worked with and met over those years. That's a pretty narrow population as well. When you're talking about African militaries, these are actually the elites of their country for the most part. These people they're educated, many of them Western educated, went to universities overseas. You know, so they're a very small sub-segment of their populations of their countries. So I wouldn't claim that these characters are necessarily representative of most of their countries. But they are representative of the people that I've worked with and I interacted with when I was working in Africa for those years. But no, to answer your question, you know, no one specifically. And because I'm writing satire, everyone's kind of embellished, but I kind of take the most extreme elements of these personalities and then fictionalize them. But there's certainly a few people during my career who particularly made an impression on me. that I stole some of their quirks and traits and made them into characters along the way.
So I have a comment related to that, and then a question for you. So in my very first novel, and then through a couple of them later, the principal conflict is involving Russia, and of course, as we all know, Putin is president of Russia, right? So he's a public figure. Public figures are fair game in fiction, right? So I put him in as the president of Russia, right? He's a bad guy, and my publisher, no, you can't do that. We could get sued. I'm really? Really? You can't buy that kind of publicity, come on. So I changed his name to Pushkin, and she said, okay, that's good. So I have to ask you, Glenn, because this has happened to me. Has anyone asked you to write them into your novels? Okay, now that's happened to me a lot.
Really?
Yeah. I've had friends from high school and coworkers say, oh, you gotta write me into your novel.
Well, I'm also writing satire too, so there's not that many characters that have many redeeming qualities in my novel. You probably don't want to be this character in any of mine because they're mostly anti-heroes. They're not, not avid characters. So what are you working on now?
Right now, I'm just kind of taking a break. I published, or I had 2 books released last year, in the spring and the fall. And the process in doing that is pretty grueling. You draft the manuscript, you submit the manuscript to the publisher, it goes through a couple of rounds of editing in which you're going to be involved in the middle of that. Then you get the final copy back to review, and it's all done on a tight timeline. So doing that for 2 books plus working full time. By October of last year, it's like, I got no idea about a plot. I don't know what I can write. So, so I decided I'm going to take a little bit of time off here, let the brain cells rest a little bit, and try to come up with a good idea for a plot.
Yeah. What do you have with brains? crazy life too. Your full-time job and you've got things going on. It's amazing how prolific you've been over the last, whatever, 10 years. Just not given everything you have on your plate.
Yeah, well, airplanes and airports and hotels are good places to write.
Well, yeah, actually, and I've written the better part of the last 2 books sitting in the front seat of my Subaru, like at Monza's or my daughter's soccer practices. So you got to take advantage of that time.
You do.
Have it.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, sitting over at my nursery waiting for them to finish up soccer. That's 4 or 5 hours a week of work time, and I don't want to sit in the car with a computer. It's easy. You can't give up time like that.
Right.
If you can make the most of that, then you can juggle more balls at one time.
Yeah,
for sure.
That's right. Yeah.
But it's you have to be disciplined about knowing when you have those blocks of time and make use of them and being prepared before that block of time begins.
Now you have an interesting project going on right now.
I do, yeah. Now I'm moving away from fiction entirely. I'm taking a break and getting actually back to what I was trained as a historian many years ago, and my first publication was history in a historical journal. And I'm getting back to that. I'm doing a history of Mount Bachelor right now, and I have a contract for that, and it's due at the end of summer, so I'm kind of getting down to the wire on finishing that book up. And it's a completely different process, and I'm really enjoying it. And as we were mentioning, we were walking in, I find writing fiction is very solitary. You're coming up with the idea, you're working by yourself. At some point you move forward and you're working with readers and editors to try to refine the product, but really it's a solitary effort at the very beginning. Whereas writing history, at least current history, doing something more modern, you're dealing with people at archives. A lot of people have pieces of the story that you need, and I'm doing interviews. I was on the phone today, did 2 interviews today with former general manager of Mount Bachelor, and another interview with the historian of the Mazamas, talking with him about the early first climbers that never summited Mount Bachelor and some of the history about the development of the Forest Service fire lookout on Mount Bachelor. So I'm always, for this project, I'm always interacting with people. I'm always calling people, I'm always interviewing people, trying to get access to photographs or either documentation or just firsthand experience, because it's modern history. So a lot of the folks that I'm talking to have worked at the mountain or had a history there. So it's a fun project because it's not just locking myself at my desk or in the front seat of the Subaru and typing away, coming up with stuff, but I'm meeting people, talking to people, and it's very interactive. So I'm enjoying it. It's a fun project, and I think I'll probably continue on doing some more history. I'm not sure if I'll go back to fiction, but if I do, it won't be for a little while.
Yeah, and you're right. Fiction is a very solitary experience until you start working with the editor. Just another side comment that I find amusing is that when you, as an author, when you think about your browser search history, it's been more than once I think, oh my God, if Google is sharing this information with the FBI. I'm researching poisons, genetic modification, viruses, and then, of course...
You're on the NSA list.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Try being your editor.
Yeah, we're on the list.
We're on every watch list.
And then you start getting these advertisements, right? They just start popping up. I started getting them for body armor, and I thought, really? Where's that coming from?
Occupational hazard.
Yeah.
That's good.
Well, I think we're just about out of time, so unless we have any questions, we can know we're about ready to wrap up, I think.
I have one more quick question. This is for both of you. What is a question about your books or your writing process or anything involving that you wish someone would ask you at like events like this that you never get asked?
You go first.
No.
It's fine to say there isn't one. There may not be one.
Yeah, I will. Well, no questions are fine with me because I'm really uncomfortable. This is the worst part of writing for me. I'm an introvert. I think most writers, a lot of writers are probably introverted, and so it's difficult for me doing marketing, doing promotion, doing speaking events. But part of the obligation of working with a publisher, I'm sure you get this pressure too, is I write for fun. I enjoy it. It's a hobby. I'm not expecting to make money or make a career out of this, but my publisher is a professional and she's trying to make money. It's her living. She's not doing this for fun. She's doing this because she wants to earn money. And I respect that, but part of her understanding with me is that I will help her be successful by doing promotions, by speaking, by doing these events, even though they make me really uncomfortable and I don't like speaking in public, I don't like speaking in front of a crowd. I do it because it's my obligation to her, because she has helped me along the way. She's published my first book and has continued to support me through the second, third book after. So the hardest thing for me about the questions is just being here in front of people and answering the questions. Period. If there's any one particular question I want to be asked or don't want to be asked.
You're just like, go away.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't ask me.
Let it be over.
Let's
move on.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah.
In fact, I haven't met an author yet who admits that they like the marketing piece of it.
Yeah, but you have to do it.
You have to do it.
It's part of what you
And I really enjoy engaging with people. You know, like it's nice talking to all of you. The frightening part is that no one shows up, right? And I tell you, that happens. And you know, that's the scary part, right? But the question that I always wish would be asked is, what motivated you to write that or that one or that one? Because every single one of my novels was based on something that really moved me for one reason or another. And that became the kernel that germinated and grew into the story. It didn't just happen, right? I mean, there was one particular thing, I'll call it. Could be a historical event, could be something out of science, it could be some geopolitical tension, but something was the spark for each one of my novels, and it's different in every single one.
Do you have like a favorite example of that?
Yeah, I do actually. This novel, Hunting Savage, that's one of my favorite novels for a lot of reasons. One reason is that the main conflict occurs up here on the slopes of Rosenthal, which is part of the Three Sisters Wilderness that I love. I've been up there many, many times. It's heaven for me. I just love it up there. And but what gave me the idea for the novel was several years ago I saw a story, a 1-hour documentary on Al Jazeera, of all networks. And the documentary was called The Day Israel Attacked America. And I thought, wow, that's pretty provocative. What's that about, right? And as I watched it, it detailed the events around one day in June of 1967, during the Six-Day War, when Israeli naval and air forces attacked the USS Liberty, which was an intelligence gathering ship. Nearly sunk it. It's a miracle the ship didn't sink. Dozens of seamen were killed, many more were injured. And anyway, there's a whole backstory around that, but I was just so moved by that and shocked, quite honestly, that could happen. And so it became the basis of this story. And if you read the book, all of the factual, or all of the accounting of that is factual, but then there's fiction around it. And so that was the trigger for that. In another book, it was the Japanese atrocities at Nanking, the massacre at Nanking. And that's what triggered me to write that story. So each one is a little bit different. But for me, that was important. Right? I mean, it was important enough that I wrote the book on it, but yet almost never asked. Anyway, thank you. Thank you.
All right, well, as we wrap up, I just wanted to say a couple of things. First, I'm pretty sure this event was your idea, so.
Yes, thank you.
But I'm just saying, you do some marketing, you're doing great. Second, our virtual event for Operation Hermes is on our YouTube from back in November. So, and I just went and looked it up, and I have blue hair.
You do. I loved it.
had
It was
blue
great.
hair.
You looked good on the video.
That was a time. Then, if you go and look at our YouTube recordings, especially our virtual events right after the pandemic first shut us down, you will see multiple bedrooms in my house and like my dining room, so there's that too. So you mentioned reviews. We would like to put a call out to remind everyone to review Roundabout Books, preferably on Google, but also on Yelp, etc. It helps with our SEO. We still have people that come in every day who say, when did you open? And we say, 5.5 years ago, where have you been? The other thing is, all of these are for sale tonight. We can check you out at that register and then have them signed. And I was going to say another thing and I've completely forgotten it, but I want to thank both of you for being here. It was about people coming to events. Every single one of you that's here tonight is showing your support not only for these authors but for our bookstore, and that is what has kept us going through the last 2.5 years when other places, restaurants, etc. have not been able to make it. We are here because of you all. So thank you so much for being here, for coming in every day, for continuing to want to do events with us, and in our new space. So again, just I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. Please grab a book. If you've already read his, try Dave's. I read War Under the Mango Tree. Did we not do an event for that, or did we do it in person? It must have been right before the shutdown. That's what it was.
There's like 4 of us. Yeah.
Were you online or in store?
In store.
Okay, so we don't have a recording of that one, sorry. But otherwise, thank you both. This was
Thank you.
amazing. Recording. Yes.
Thanks, man. Really appreciate it.
Responsible.